left side forward, or right side forward, left side backwards, make sure it does what you want it to do.
Yeah.
All right.
Rohan, can you see this?
Yeah, I can see that. Thank you.
All right, sir. I will start on your count, on your go.
All right, small business and the CARES Act. So let's start with some background on the CARES Act itself. The CARES Act was signed into legislation in March of 2020 by the Trump administration. The act took an overall size of about $2 trillion, and this made it the largest economic reform act in all of American history. But to my surprise, there was very little research done on how effective the act actually was. So, going into that, a lot of that money was directed at aiding small business survival, because small businesses were one of the most damaged aspects from the COVID pandemic. Under the CARES Act, there were two major programs directed at aiding small businesses. Number one was the Paycheck Protection Program on the right. In the Paycheck Protection Program, small business owners could apply for up to $10 million, but there was a catch. You could only use this money on paying the wages for your employees or on company utilities. On the other hand, you have the Economic Injury Disaster Loan. In this loan, small business owners could apply for up to $2 million, a lot less, but they could use this money for anything that they deemed necessary. So, when I was going through my research, three major sources guided my research. They helped me formulate my research question. The first one of these was the Warner-Norcross Review. Now, to put it simply, this source was essentially just a very in-depth review of the CARES Act itself. It helped me understand the various components and the purposes of the Act and the other programs under it. The second source that I came across was the Michael Strain study. This study was done before the CARES Act was actually released, and it detailed how much small businesses across the nation were affected by the COVID pandemic. Another important thing this source included is that it identified a factor which influenced how much small businesses in a given community were affected by the pandemic. The third and final source that I came across was the United States Small Business Administration Survey. Now, in this source, they basically asked small business owners across the nation about different problems they had with the Paycheck Protection Program, and it was very contextual to me. So, these three sources together helped me formulate my research question, or my goal, which was to find to what extent have the various programs under the CARES Act influenced or aided small business survival in Brecksville, Ohio. Now, I chose Brecksville because it was a middle-income city, right in the middle of the scale, and income was identified by the Michael Strain study to be one of the most influential factors in how much a community was affected by the pandemic. I also chose it because it was very accessible to me as the researcher. So, in terms of my method, I chose to use a content analysis method. The content that I would be analyzing in my scenario were survey responses that I collected from these small business owners directly. Now, I would later conduct a thematic analysis of these responses in search of common themes that arose and answers for my research question. Now, I came up with this method after coming across two sources. Number one was the Small Business Administration source that I mentioned earlier, and the other was a source from New York City, in which researchers of the study asked small business owners directly through a survey method on their different opinions of the small business competition in their community. Now, this wasn't a direct relation to my study, but I also thought that the method that they used was applicable to mine because it was directly addressing the small business owners of the community. So, in terms of my method or the survey, I administered in two different ways. The first way was digitally. I developed the survey on Google Forms, and I sent it out through the Gmails of these small business owners, which I found online. But I encountered a very low response rate when I was using this method. So naturally, I knew that if I continued this way, I wouldn't collect enough data to form a meaningful conclusion. Naturally, what I had to do was switch my method. So what I did was I switched from a digital survey to an oral survey, where I talked to the small business owners directly, asking for their opinions. And in this method, I found that the response rate was a lot higher, somewhere where I can form a meaningful conclusion. Now, in terms of the survey, I made it 5 questions. Now, this may seem short, but you have to understand that given that I was surveying small business owners, they're very busy people. In order to make them feel more inclined to answer my survey, I had to make it short to accommodate their needs. But also, 5 questions was really all that I needed to get to the data that I really needed to form a meaningful conclusion. So in terms of the first question of my survey, it was very straightforward. I only asked them what service or product they provide, just to simply get a simple gauge on what they do. The second question asked them how much the pandemic had affected their business. Now my goal in asking this question was to see if there was a correlation to the first question, and to see if how much they had been affected had anything to do with what they did or sold to their consumers. The third question was supplemental. I basically just asked them what programs under the CARES Act they made use of, whether this was the Economic Injury Disaster Loan, Paycheck Protection Program, or neither. Now the fourth question was by far the most important question in my survey, because this was a direct address of my research question. I asked the small business owners to rate the benefit of the CARES Act directly or indirectly on small businesses in Brecksville, Ohio, on a scale of 1 to 10. And this was a direct address of my research question. I considered it the most important data that I could find. The final question was supplemental once again, and I basically asked the small business owners for future suggestions on economic reform acts. Now I had 2 goals in asking this question. One was to develop implications for my research, and the second was to see if I could find any possible explanations for why they rated the act the way they did in the previous question. Now going into the specifics of the fourth question, since this was the most important, I made it on a simple scale of 1 to 10. Now I did this number 1 because it was very simple, it was very straightforward. But number 2, I did this because I wanted to have a strong numerical value off of which I could base my conclusion. And this would make it very simple. So a 1 on this scale would mean that the act was essentially useless, and a 10 would mean that it was vital and crucial in ensuring the small business survival in small businesses of Brecksville, Ohio. Now, I hypothesized that the act would receive an average rating of around 2 or 3, which would imply that it would have a minimal benefit on small business survival in Brecksville, Ohio. Now, I hypothesized this because referring back to the Michael Strain source in my foundational sources, he identified that income level was one of the main factors in determining how much a community was affected by the pandemic in terms of small business. Brecksville, if you look at Brecksville, they're a medium to high income city. So I hypothesized that the effect of the pandemic would be minimal on our community, and therefore the CARES Act would be of minimal benefit as well. Now, after going through the whole data collection process, after sending out my survey, I ended up with a total of 26 responses. Now, this may seem like a small number given traditional surveys, but this is actually right where I want it to be, because 26 captures just about 10% of the entire small business community in Brecksville. Now, 14 of the responses that I collected were small business owners who applied for the Paycheck Protection Program. 4 of them had applied for the Economic Injury Disaster Loan, and 8 of them had applied for neither. So I didn't get as much variability as I would have preferred to here, but that's just how it goes with random sampling. Now, in terms of the second question, I noticed a kind of interesting phenomenon here, but it was also somewhat obvious. What I found was that companies that sold material goods were not as affected by the pandemic as companies who sold services. And this seems quite obvious when we look at it, because at the peak of the quarantine, or at the peak of the pandemic, Ohio had instilled quarantine regulations. So people were doing whatever they could to avoid contact with other people. And so naturally, they weren't going to places like hair salons, and so companies that provided human contact services were a lot more hurt than companies that provided material goods. Now the next slide is the big reveal. The average rating that the CARES Act received in Brecksville, Ohio was a whopping 4.65. Now this was double my hypothesis, or about the value that I predicted. But this doesn't imply that it was far off of what I was thinking. Now an effective economic act would have received somewhere between a 7 to an 8. A useless one would have received somewhere between a 1 to a 2. But the CARES Act received a 4.65, right in the middle of where I was thinking. So I had to ask myself, why did the CARES Act receive a 4.65? Why did it receive such a mediocre rating? So the bottom line, or the answer to this question, is the fact that the CARES Act was nothing but a buffer. It was not a permanent solution. A lot of these small business owners describe the act as nothing but a band-aid. So if you think about this logically, these small business owners, the problem that they were having was a lessened demand for their service, product, or good. And the Small Business Administration throwing money at them through acts like the Paycheck Protection Program or the Economic Injury Disaster Loan did not solve this underlying problem of a lessened demand for their product. Now, in terms of the fifth and final question, where I asked for future suggestions, after conducting a thematic analysis of the responses, I ended with a total of 3 themes that I identified to be major across the 26 small business owners that I surveyed. In cascading order of prominence, the number 1 theme that I noticed was application complexity. The number 2 was the finalization of the forgiveness program, and number 3 was eligibility for the different loans. Now going through these, number 1, a lot of these small business owners complained about the complexity of the application process. They called it long and delayed. Now essentially what this means is that when they were applying, it would take weeks or even months for the Small Business Administration to get back to them with the money that they were requesting. And when you're a company or a small business that's about to go under, you don't have the luxury of time. So this was a problem. And it's for this reason that experts on the act, like Jennifer Boudin, described it as nothing but complicated for everyone. And that's exactly what we saw in Brexit as well. The second main theme that I saw was the finalization of the forgiveness program. Small business owners recommended that in the future, the forgiveness program be finalized a lot sooner than it actually was. And the forgiveness program essentially means that as a small business owner, once you take a loan from the Small Business Administration, you are required to pay that loan back at some point in time. But if you apply for the forgiveness program and you make it through this program, you are no longer required to pay that money back. And this was the main reason why the CARES Act was described as nothing but a short-term fix. Because the fact is, as a small business owner, once you take that loan, that money is going to be hanging over your head until you're in some sort of condition to pay that back. And unfortunately, no sort of business that I interviewed or surveyed here was in any sort of condition to pay it back anytime soon. The final and third theme that I saw here was eligibility, and I noticed a sort of interesting phenomenon here, but once again, it was somewhat obvious. So what I noticed here was that the small business owners who were eligible for the act, who got through, wanted them to narrow the parameters or make it harder to get in. On the other hand, alternatively, those who were ineligible or did not make it through the application process wanted to widen the parameters so they could get in and get the money. And this made a lot of sense. So essentially the bottom line here was that small business owners wanted whatever would get them the most money and less of it to other people. And that makes a lot of sense given, natural small business competition. So, in terms of limitations, I identified 3 major limitations to my study. Naturally, it isn't perfect. The first limitation is revisions. Now, when I was doing my data collection, the CARES Act was a very new act. It was a new piece of legislation. So naturally, the government was making constant revisions to the act. And that includes during the time of my data collection process. Now, while there were no major changes made to the act during the time that I was surveying my small business owners, I do think that minor changes here and there could have, to some extent, made my results inaccurate. The second limitation that I identify is my method switch. Well, while switching from a digital survey to an oral survey was necessary to form a meaningful conclusion, I do believe it could have caused some sort of discrepancy in the results that I received, especially in my 5th question. The final limitation that I identify is my city focus. Now, at the beginning, I believed that focusing just on Brecksville, because it has a middle income or middle to high income, would be a good move so that I could generalize my data. But as I went on through the study and I found more sources like the Michael Strain study, I realized that looking at one city with one income does not allow me to generalize my data to the entire nation. Now, given these limitations, I do still think there are some big implications to the research that I've done here. And that takes the form of future economic reform. I believe that by implementing the changes or learning from the mistakes that we saw here in the CARES Act, we can improve future economic and increase their efficiency so that owners can maximize the benefit to them and be more resistant to changes like the COVID pandemic. Now, where should future research focus given these implications and limitations? I believe that future research should focus on 3 things. Number 1, future research or similar studies to mine should have a wider focus. And by that, I mean it should encompass multiple different kinds of communities with varying income levels so that they can generalize the data to the entire nation. The second thing I think it should do is have a consistent survey. And I mean this in the regard that there should be no sort of changes being made to the Act during the time of the data collection process, just so there are no discrepancies in the results. The final and third thing that I think further down the road research can focus on is actually implementing the shifts that small business owners recommended in the 5th question and seeing if they work in the real world. But that's way down the road. We can see if they actually work in the real world or not and see to what extent that these will be helpful. So bottom line here, we can see some big picture changes in future economic reform as long as we use my data as a starting point to fill in this larger gap, and we can start to see some big improvements for small businesses all across the nation. So there's some works cited. Thank you all for your attention, and if the board has any questions, I'd love to take them now.
Excellent. We'll turn it over to Mr. Roderick for the first question.
Rohan, did the choices you made when designing or implementing your research method impact your research process?
Yes, they did. So I mean this in the regard that when I was considering my research method, my original idea was to go with a content analysis of existing data. So that data encompassed maybe small business administration surveys like the one I mentioned in my foundational sources, or other sources like the Michael Strain study. But what I realized was that if I use this method, I'm not going to be able to form a meaningful conclusion. I'm not going to be able to fill a gap that's actually meaningful in this field. So I realized that I have to actually go out and collect data on my own if I want to have a meaningful conclusion. So I switched to an actual survey method where I went to collect my own data. And in doing so, I had to shift my focus from finding existing data to collecting my own variable data that can be used to form a meaningful conclusion.
And we'll head over to Mr. Martin for question number 2.
How do the limitations of your method or data influence your new understanding?
Okay, so when I took my limitations into account, the main realization that I had was that my data was not generalizable. Now, going into this study, I believed that once I chose Brexville as a middle income city, I could generalize my data because it's right in the middle of the scale. But after looking at more sources, I realized that that was an incorrect statement and I wouldn't be able to generalize my data. So the bottom line here is, with my limitations, I do believe there's some inaccuracy with regards to the average rating that the Act received from the small business owners. And more importantly, my data cannot be generalized because of its focus on one middle income community.
Okay, and finally, think back to the initial curiosity that sparked your inquiry. What other curiosities do you have, and how has this process prepared you to explore them?
Okay, so a lot of the curiosities I had when I was starting out this whole research process actually didn't pertain to the CARES Act at all. I wanted to study small business, and more importantly, I wanted to see how different levels of small business competition in different communities affected the health of the various small businesses in that area. So although that was pretty far off from where I ended up with my research question, I actually think I got some data which could be cross-applied to that topic. Essentially in the second question, or the fifth question for that matter, I realized that small business competition can be beneficial and harmful in a lot of ways, and that kind of helped me form a conclusion to my initial curiosity.
All right. We are clear. Nice job.